The start of Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941 unleashed 3 German army groups onto the Soviet Union. Army Group North drove into the Baltic states towards its objective at Leningrad. Army Group Center smashed through Belorussia, aiming at Moscow, the Soviet capital. Army Group South was directed to seize the industrial and agricultural resources of the Ukraine, reaching as far east as Rostov-on-Don as a springboard for a further advance, threatening the oil fields of the Caucasus and perhaps even British possessions in the Middle East. By the middle of September, Army Group South, with its Hungarian and Romanian allies, was well over halfway to the Don, and 650,000 Soviet troops had been trapped at Kiev. However, 2 points of resistance had been left behind the German front line. The city of Odessa was still holding out on the Black Sea coast against a mainly Romanian besieging force. The Crimean Peninsula remained in Soviet hands, posing a serious problem for Army Group South headquarters. The Crimea had no economic importance for the Germans, but strategically it was vital. From its base at Sevastopol, the Soviet fleet could dominate the Black Sea, and from airfields in the Crimea, the Soviet Air Force could attack the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești that were crucial for the German war machine. Hitler in fact called the Crimea a Soviet aircraft carrier in their attack on Romania's oil. Of more immediate concern to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of Army Group South, was the threat posed to his right flank as he prepared to renew his advance after the Soviet disaster at Kiev. He could hardly leave the Crimea as an assembly area for a counter-offensive into his lightly garrisoned rear areas. On the other hand, if the Germans could occupy the Crimea, they would not only remove the threat to Ploiești and limit the Black Sea Fleet's operations, but one of the gateways to the Caucasus would only be a short sea passage away, across the Kerch Straits. The advance from Rostov would involve a long approach march across the almost roadless wastes of the Kuban steppe between the Sea of Azov and the Caspian Sea. The early arrival of German troops in the foothills of the Caucasus might encourage anti-Soviet feeling among the local population, and perhaps even prompt Turkey to join the Axis powers. Von Rundstedt assigned the mission of capturing the Crimea to his southernmost army, 11th Army. The army was also tasked to continue its advance towards Rostov. On the 12th of September, General of Infantry Erich von Manstein was appointed the new commander of 11th Army, and 5 days later he arrived at its headquarters in Nikolaev. Von Manstein was the embodiment of the Prussian military tradition. He served as von Rundstedt's chief of staff in the invasion of Poland in 1939, and by 1941 his reputation within the German army was well established. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, Manstein was commanding 56th Panzer Corps in Army Group North, and although he'd never served with armoured troops before, he soon proved his abilities with a run of successes. Manstein was quick to assess the difficulties in his task ahead. His orders emphasized the importance of capturing the Crimea quickly and getting a force across the Kerch Straits, but at the same time he was instructed to provide the southern wing of Army Group South's march on Rostov. 11th Army was expected to attack southwards to penetrate a heavily defended bottleneck to the Crimea, probably followed by the siege of a fortified naval base. However, at the same time, it had to try to keep up with Army Group South's armoured spearhead, 1st Panzer Group, in its exploitation battles to the east. At first, these tasks looked to be beyond 11th Army's resources. 2 Corps, 30th Corps with 2 infantry divisions and the motorised Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, and 49th Mountain Corps with 2 mountain divisions and an infantry division, were approaching the line from Melitopol to Zaporozhye as they pursued the retreating Red Army eastwards. A 3rd Corps, the 54th, was preparing to attack the Crimea across the fortified Perekop Isthmus, with only 2 infantry divisions in place, and another due to arrive after mopping up at Odessa and along the Black Sea coast. In addition, there was the Romanian 3rd Army that was affiliated to 11th Army, but not directly under Manstein's command. The general opinion amongst the Germans was that, having occupied Moldova, the Romanians had achieved their war aims and were in no hurry to take a fuller part in the war. Assessing his missions and the forces assigned to him, Manstein quickly decided that he could not give the same priority to both tasks. He decided to concentrate on the Crimea first, because an advance eastwards was too dangerous unless the Crimea was occupied, and because of the importance the German High Command put on reaching the Caucasus from Kerch. He began to regroup his forces. The strategic geography of the Crimea shaped Manstein's plans. The peninsula is a rough diamond shape, nearly 200 miles across from eastern to western tips and 125 miles from north to south. A belt of lakes and marshes known as the Sivash Sea separates the Crimea from the mainland. It's 15 to 25 miles wide and a horrendous military obstacle. There are only 2 land routes onto the peninsula. The Perekop Isthmus in the west is roughly 5 miles wide and cut by an ancient fortification known as the Tatar Ditch that is up to 50 feet deep. In the east, a railway runs along the Chongar Peninsula that is so narrow in places that the sea lies on either side of the embankment. Most of the peninsula is open steppe, with almost no settlements or defence lines. But the southern third is occupied by the Yala Mountains. They shield the southern coasts from northerly winds in winter, protecting the Black Sea coast. In the southwest lies Sevastopol, the great naval base. There are some less important harbours, such as Yevpatoria in the east, and Balaklava, Yalta, and Feodosia in the south, that played minor roles in the campaign. Finally, the port of Kerch gives its name to the peninsula that stretches eastwards and is separated by a narrow strait from the Taman Peninsula and the mainland north of the Caucasus. Although the Perekop Isthmus had been fortified in depth with 2 deep belts of defences, Manstein decided that he had no alternative but to fight a breakthrough battle there. The isthmus could not be outflanked, and the Germans had no amphibious resources for a landing operation. So Manstein reinforced 54th Corps with all the artillery and engineers he could find, and ordered 50th Infantry Division to join the Corps for the final breakthrough. Realizing that the breakthrough battle would almost exhaust 54th Corps, he pulled the German 49th Mountain Corps away from the battle in the steppes so that it could exploit the breakthrough and reach Kerch, from where the High Command wished it to advance into the Caucasus. Manstein hoped to use the motorized Leibstandarte division to take Sevastopol by a surprise thrust. This left only the 30th Corps to maintain the pressure on the retreating Russians, But Manstein managed to persuade General Dumitrescu, the commander of the 3rd Romanian Army, to move across the Dnieper River and join the eastwards pursuit. This added a cavalry corps and a mountain corps, each of 3 brigades, to the eastern push. But Manstein was still taking the conscious risk that the Russians would not stop their withdrawal and counterattack. Manstein would have liked to start the assault at Perekop on the 20th of September, but was forced to wait until the 24th. 11th Army had advanced over 300 miles since it crossed the Soviet border, and supply convoys were struggling to keep up over poor roads. On the Soviet side, the defense of the Crimea was entrusted to 51st Separate Army that had 4 infantry divisions, 4 militia divisions, and a cavalry group of 3 divisions under command, but these were mostly newly raised formations. The army commander, Colonel General Kuznetsov, did not really expect an attack on the Crimea. He deployed 3 of his infantry divisions under 9th Rifle Corps along the northern coast, with the 156th Rifle Division holding the Perekop Isthmus. Most of the militia divisions were dispersed to defend the coasts, and 2 operational groups were kept in the center of the peninsula to counterattack against any German assault. About 30,000 men defended the north of the peninsula. 40,000 men were along the coasts, and 25,000 were held in the operational groups in the center. When the attack began, Manstein had 3 divisions in his front line. During the night of the 23rd and 24th of September, the 22nd Division launched diversionary attacks away from the Perekop Isthmus. Supported by all available aircraft and artillery, 54th Corps launched 45th and 73rd Infantry Divisions into the attack at 4:30 on the morning of September the 24th. They were bitterly resisted by the 156th Rifle Division and had to fight for every machine gun post and pillbox. Manstein had expected this and had ordered his troops to bypass Russian strongpoints as much as possible. Using these tactics, 73rd Division managed to advance about 2 miles on the western side of the isthmus. But by the afternoon of the 24th of September, there was no sign of an early breakthrough. The grinding breakthrough battle continued for the next 3 days. Every battalion commander in 156th Rifle Division was killed as they tried to stiffen the defense by their personal example. The deputy commander of 51st Army, General Batov, led an operational group formed from 2 rifle and 1 cavalry divisions that began to move from the central part of the peninsula on the 25th of September to join the battle at Perekop. But the group had to march over 60 miles under constant air attack, delaying its advance. The Luftwaffe's total air superiority also helped the German infantry to deal with the defences at Perekop. Just before dawn on the 26th of September, 73rd Infantry Division began its attack on the Tatar Ditch. After a concentrated artillery barrage, the infantry and assault pioneers slid into the ditch and struggled up the far slope. Gradually a foothold was achieved, and during the following night both divisions worked their way towards Armyansk at the back of the first belt of defences that was 10 miles deep. But Batov's counter-attacking forces drove the Germans out in a charge delivered just before first light. The battle for territory continued back and forth for another couple of days before the German advance finally halted. But it was not the Soviet resistance in the Crimea, however desperate, that prevented a complete breakthrough. Events on the steppe further north forced Manstein to change his plans completely. Despite its immense losses in the first 3 months of the war, the Red Army had managed to find new reserves. Two armies, the 9th and the 18th, had been reformed and held a defensive line running west of Melitopol northwards to the Dnieper Bend near Zaporozhye. From the 22nd of September, they began to launch minor attacks that were checked without causing 11th Army much concern, although they began to wear down the resistance of the Romanian units sandwiched between the German divisions on this sector of the front. Eventually, these attacks increased in scale until more than 10 infantry divisions, with at least one armour brigade, started probing the gaps between German and Romanian formations. On the morning of the 27th of September, the tide began to turn. The 2nd and 4th Romanian mountain brigades began to weaken in the face of attacks led by tanks that their anti-tank weapons could not stop. German units were also coming under pressure. The 22nd Infantry Division between the Sivash and Melitopol had been reduced to the combat strength of a small regiment, and its commander was starting to talk of withdrawal. Wasting no time, Manstein reacted quickly. First, he ordered that there was to be no withdrawal. Second, he checked the forces moving to complete the breakthrough into the Crimea. 49th Mountain Corps and the Liebstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division were turned back, and Manstein moved his tactical headquarters to the northeast in order to make his presence felt among the wavering Romanian staffs. On the 29th of September, 49th Mountain Corps began a counterattack in support of the 3rd Romanian Army, and the northern arm of the Soviet counterattack was confirmed. The Liebstandarte was about to follow up this attack when a Romanian cavalry brigade gave way in the centre. Manstein was on hand to prevent this and swing the Liebstandarte division to oppose the threatened breakthrough on the 1st of October. Things were looking brighter for the Germans. The battle began to turn in their favour. Besides taking his own measures to check the Soviet advance, Manstein had been urging Army Group South to organise a major counterstroke. The Soviet 9th and 18th Armies were now fully engaged in the battle against 11th Army, leaving their northern flank vulnerable to a blow from General von Keist's 1st Panzer Army. Army Group South quickly seized the opportunity, and 1st Panzer Army began to cross the Dnieper at the Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk bridgeheads on the 1st of October. By the next morning, reports were reaching Manstein that the Russians were beginning to withdraw to the east. By the 3rd of October, 11th Army was able to order its eastern grouping to pursue the disappearing enemy. On the 6th, Melitopol was captured and 49th Mountain Corps linked up with von Kleist's panzers. By the end of the battle, over 100,000 prisoners had been captured, and the 9th and 18th Armies were ruined. The 11th Army took 27,000 prisoners, 130 guns, and 64 tanks. In Manstein's view, the Russians had missed a great opportunity. Their forces were so superior to 11th Army at the start of the operation that if they had been better led, they could have destroyed the German position south of the Dnieper. As it was, the road to Rostov was laid open for Army Group South. By now, Hitler had agreed that 11th Army could not fight a battle on two increasingly separated fronts, and gave orders for Manstein to concentrate on the Crimea. But he was also told to hand over 49th Mountain Corps and the Liebstandarte Division to von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army for the advance to Rostov. This left Manstein with 30th and 54th Corps, a total of 6 infantry divisions, most of which had been heavily engaged in the earlier battles. The 3rd Romanian Army was to take over coastal defence on the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. 42nd Corps, with 2 infantry divisions, was sent to the Crimea, although one division had to be diverted elsewhere before it arrived. Manstein was lumbered with a rather old-fashioned army, an infantry-artillery hybrid with no tanks under command, and still heavily dependent on horse transport. He was determined that 11th Army should have a mobile force that could exploit a breakthrough when it was achieved. So Group Ziegler was improvised from Romanian motorized infantry units and more mobile German elements. This was better than nothing, but it was a long way from the panzer divisions leading the terrifying German blitzkrieg. While 11th Army's attack was stalled, the Russians had been strengthening the Crimea's defences. South of Perekop, two small lakes split the isthmus into three narrow strips of land, two of which joined at the village of Ishun. This was the last good defensive position in the north of the peninsula. If it was lost, the Russians would be forced back to the southern mountains and the defences of Sevastopol and Kirch. They were determined to hold the Ishun position at all costs. In the first weeks of October, concrete pillboxes, minefields and anti-tank ditches were added to the defences up to 10 miles deep. The immediate defence of Ishun was assigned to General Batov's operational group of 4 small divisions. 51st Army's commander, General Kuznetsov, continued to hold more forces along the northern coast and in the centre of the peninsula, but they couldn't influence the decisive battle. Shortly after the German attack began, Kuznetsov was relieved of his command and replaced by the more determined Batov. In Moscow, Stalin had also come to realize that the defense of Odessa, however heroic, was a waste of troops. The garrison would be better used to fight Germans in the vital Crimea than the mostly Romanian force attacking Odessa. The evacuation was completed on the night of the 16th of October, and 86,000 troops, 500 guns and 20,000 tons of ammunition, plus tanks and vehicles, were landed in Sevastopol and Yevpatoria by the Black Sea's fleet. They were formed into the Coastal Army under General Petrov and began to assemble near Simferopol. All its divisions were under strength and short of equipment, but they were soon drawn into the struggle at Ishun. Manstein had no choice but to fight another attritional battle in horrendous conditions. With no feasible way to bypass the Soviet defences, surprise and manoeuvre were impossible. At the start of the operation, Manstein could only deploy the 54th Corps and 3 divisions on the narrow strips of ground around Ishun, so the attackers didn't outnumber the defenders. Manstein could rely on his artillery, but this advantage was offset by the Soviet superiority in the air. Whereas 11th Army had benefited from the support of the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Corps in the earlier battle at Perekop, the Corps had now been ordered to support 1st Panzer Army as well. At this stage in the war, the German army was not used to operating without the Luftwaffe's support, and the lack of air cover began to sap the soldiers' morale. The offensive began on the 18th of October. On the first day, 54th Corps only managed to penetrate the Soviet outpost line. Meanwhile, 11th Army's war diary noted the Russians' extraordinary infantry resistance, strongly built-up positions, extensive minefields, intense artillery bombardments, and air resistance. In fact, a 10-day battle had begun that would test Manstein's qualities as a general to their limits. Visiting the front every day, he could see for himself the alarming way in which the combat power of his divisions was wasting away. Officer casualties were dangerously high, and staff officers had to be turned into frontline commanders. From the 22nd of October, the rain turned a dire situation into a living hell. Roads turned to mud, and supplies ran desperately short. Ammunition shortages threatened to stop some divisions. Manstein rose to the challenge. Although he couldn't avoid sending his troops into frontal attacks, he did ensure that these were always properly coordinated with the artillery and, when available, air support. He kept pressing his superiors to provide more air support until Goering sent reinforcements to 4th Air Corps. Fighters under Colonel Mulders, the first ace to be awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords and diamonds after his 100th victory in July 1941, were sent to hold the Soviet Air Force at bay while ground attack aircraft began to pound the Russian frontline positions. When the crisis struck after a week of slow, grinding progress, Manstein had to judge whether his troops could continue and if the Soviet defense was about to break. On the 27th of October, 54th Corps broke through the centre of the defensive belt, and Group Ziegler was able to pass through and begin its dash to block the road to Sevastopol. The next day, the Russians began to withdraw, with the 51st Army retreating southeast towards Kirch, while the Coastal Army pulled back to Simferopol, covering the main road to Sevastopol. The nature of the battle changed immediately. Manstein had to ask his weary troops to pursue and, if possible, cut off the retreating Soviet forces. He hoped to seize Sevastopol in the rush and to prevent 51st Army's escape from Kirch. The German troops responded instinctively, capturing thousands of Soviet troops. But in the worsening weather, and with a very small mobile force, it was impossible to prevent significant numbers of Russians from escaping. The 42nd Corps reached the outskirts of Kirch on the 6th of November, but the port was only secured 10 days later, by which time about 40,000 Soviet troops had escaped by sea. Simferopol and the Yala Mountains were rapidly secured by 30th Corps, although some Russian troops escaped to operate as partisans from caves and other hideouts. However, as 54th Corps approached Sevastopol, it met stiffening resistance and even some counterattacks. In the end, the plan to capture Sevastopol from the march had to be abandoned, and 11th Army began to plan an early assault on the fortifications. But as the notorious Russian winter began to bite, problems started multiplying. Logistics were hit the hardest. In the Crimea, with its milder climate, continuing rain was the biggest problem. Most roads were unusable. But further north, the Ukraine was in the grip of ice and snow. South of the Dnieper River, only one railway engine was working, and 11th Army needed more than 3 trainloads of supplies each day to stockpile the ammunition for an assault on Sevastopol. Manstein had originally hoped to begin the attack on the 27th of November, but it was actually the 17th of December before the preparations were complete. Meanwhile, the Russians worked frantically to improve their defences. On the 7th of November, Stavka, the Soviet Supreme Headquarters in Moscow, established the Sevastopol defensive region that was ordered to defend the besieged city to the last man. Vice Admiral Oktyabrski, commander of the Black Seas Fleet, was put in charge of the defensive region, and Major General Petrov, commander of the Coastal Army, was made his deputy for land forces. Oktyabrski had been working to improve the defences since the summer, and by December, Sevastopol had become one of the most strongly fortified places in the world. Three defence lines covered the base. The forward line was 27 miles long and 10 miles from the centre of Sevastopol. About 3 miles behind that was the main line, which was 23 miles long, running from the river Katya in the north to Balaklava, south of Sevastopol. Finally, there was the rear line, which was 18 miles long and backed by an anti-tank ditch, covered by artillery and machine guns. Modern coastal defences batteries, armoured turrets on concrete emplacements with 44 guns of up to 12 inches in calibre, could cover the land approaches as well as the sea, and were reinforced by newly constructed positions using guns from damaged warships. The Sevastopol fortress contained 82 coastal and field artillery positions, 20 miles of anti-tank ditch, 35 miles of barbed wire entanglements, and nearly 10,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Petrov's coastal army had 4 rifle divisions that were each allocated a sector of the defences. There were also a number of naval infantry brigades and battalions, some of which had been raised from sailors in the naval base. The bulk of the Black Sea's fleet was withdrawn to Novorossiysk at the beginning of November, leaving 2 cruisers, 3 destroyers and some small craft in the harbour. But the old battleship Sevastopol and a number of cruisers made a series of trips back to Sevastopol to bombard German positions. Destroyers and other small ships were responsible for resupplying Sevastopol, using darkness and bad weather to dodge German air attacks. Manstein was once again about to commit his troops to head-on attacks against strong defensive positions with inadequate resources, something far removed from the wide-ranging battles of manoeuvre for which he is famous. Yet again, he had no alternative. It would be impossible to launch a force across the Kerch Straits while Sevastopol held out in his rear. In planning the attack, Manstein decided that there were 2 possible lines of approach, from north or south. The hilly, wooded terrain in the centre made an attack from the east too difficult. The defences were weaker in the south, but the poor roads made it impossible for the Germans to assemble and supply a strong enough assault force from the Balaclava direction. The northern route was more practicable and led to the hills that commanded Severnaya Bay, the main anchorage. Manstein's resources were totally inadequate for an assault on a large fortified area. By early November, his army consisted of 3 German Corps headquarters with 8 infantry divisions under their command, and the Romanian Mountain Corps. Only 2 of the infantry divisions were reasonably fresh and approaching full strength. One division, 72nd Infantry, had been so mauled in the earlier fighting that its companies numbered from only 12 to 61 men. 11th Army was a quarter under strength, with the largest shortages among the infantry who would have to lead the attack. Concentrating enough power to shatter the Sevastopol defences would mean taking a huge risk. Manstein allocated 42nd Corps headquarters to defend the coast against Soviet landings, but he allowed it only 1 German division and a Romanian brigade. They were concentrated in the Kerch Peninsula, where the threat of a landing seemed greatest. This left 7 divisions around Sevastopol. The main northern attack was to be delivered by 54th Corps, with 4 divisions that were to concentrate on pushing down the Belbek River Valley and seizing the Mackenzie Heights that overlook Severnaya Bay. A supporting attack by 30th Corps with 2 German divisions and the Romanian Mountain Corps would then advance from the southeast on the axis of the Chernaya River Valley. Meanwhile, the 50th Division was to attack from the east to link the 2 attacks and capture the commanding ground at Memorial Heights. But Manstein's plans would not remain intact for long. Manstein's tactics were once again upset by Soviet actions away from the Crimea. The 1st Panzer Army had reached Rostov, but the Red Army launched a counter-offensive into Army Group South's overextended northern flank on the 17th of November. In late November, von Rundstedt decided to order the 1st Panzer Army to withdraw from Rostov. But this order was countermanded by Hitler, who sacked von Rundstedt on the 1st of December. Because of the crisis at Rostov, Army Group South wanted to take 2 of Manstein's divisions from the Crimea. He protested, but could not prevent the loss of 73rd Division. This was the only division that was not committed in the line around Sevastopol or at Kirch, because it was earmarked as 54th Corps Reserve to complete the breakthrough to the heights north of Severnaya Bay. Despite the risk, Manstein had little choice but to press ahead with the assault. The attack was timed to start at 6:10 on the morning of the 17th of December. There was no preliminary artillery bombardment in the hope of winning an element of surprise. Instead, the artillery were to concentrate on the strong points in the Soviet line, trying to break the defenders' morale and help the assault infantry infiltrate as deeply as possible, cutting lines of retreat. On the first day, the furthest advance was achieved by the 22nd Division, which managed to press up to 5 kilometers down the Belbek Valley. But the other divisions were held up by the rugged terrain and determined Soviet resistance. The Germans continued to make slow progress until the 23rd of December, when the 22nd Division seized crucial ground north of the Belbek River and forced the Russians to withdraw their remaining forces in the northern sector. Both sides were rapidly using up their reserves. On the 20th of December, Stavka transferred the Sevastopol defensive region to the Trans-Caucasus Front, which was ordered to send reinforcements to the city. A rifle division and a naval infantry brigade were landed in Sevastopol a day later. But Manstein could get no reinforcements. 22nd Division kept moving forward, but the spearhead of its advance was getting smaller every day. On the 26th of December, its leading regiment almost reached Fort Stalin, one of the 2 great artillery batteries overlooking Severnaya Bay. But the division was on the verge of collapse. A reserve division could have completed the breakthrough, but Manstein had no reserves. If anything, the first assault on Sevastopol was about to fail, because early on the 26th of December, the Russians began to land troops on the Kerch Peninsula. Even as he started to move forces away from Sevastopol to meet this threat, Manstein ordered one more attack by the gallant 22nd Division, but Fort Stalin held out. Manstein was forced not only to call off the attack on the 30th of December, but also to order the division to pull back to a less exposed position on the northern side of the Belbek Valley. 5 months would pass before he could turn his attention back to Sevastopol. The Kerch landings were not a small diversion, but part of the strategic counter-offensive that Stalin had ordered along the whole Eastern Front in December 1941. The Trans-Caucasus Front, with the Black Sea Fleet and the Azov Flotilla, were in the process of landing over 40,000 men in Crimea. The original Soviet plan was to land 20,000 men of the 51st Army on either side of Kirch, at the eastern end of the peninsula. Meanwhile, 44th Army, with 22,000 men, would land at Feodosia in the west and move north and cut the peninsula at its narrowest point at Parpak. However, bad weather and the need to send reinforcements into Sevastopol made it impossible to launch the attacks together. 51st Army was only able to land about 3,000 men on the 26th of December, and because of the winds and rough seas, it took 5 days to get 20,000 men ashore in a number of small and isolated beachheads. The 46th Infantry Division, the German garrison in the Kerch Peninsula, was beginning to deal with the beachheads in turn when 44th Army started to land at Feodosia on the morning of the 29th of December. The only German troops present were an engineer battalion that had been billeted in the town for the night. As wave upon wave of Russian troops came ashore, the German battalion was soon pushed inland. The defence of the Kirch sector was the responsibility of 42nd Corps, under Lieutenant General Graf von Sponeck. Alarmed by the landings at Feodosia, he ordered 46th Division to pull out of the Kirch Peninsula before it was cut off. Manstein countermanded the order, but von Sponeck's headquarters was already moving back, and radio contact had been broken. 46th Division got clear, but lost most of its transport and heavy equipment in the process, so that when Manstein ordered it to turn about and attack, the division could only manage a show of obedience. Manstein relieved von Sponeck of command, but Hitler insisted on a court-martial. The court, chaired by Goering, sentenced von Sponeck to death. In fact, the situation at Kirch and Feodosia was not as serious as Manstein had feared, largely because the two Soviet armies failed to exploit the opportunities in front of them. Both concentrated on securing the perimeters around their beachheads and made little attempt to expand them. As a result, Manstein was given time to move troops from Sevastopol, although his redeployment was delayed on the night of the 4th and 5th of January when the Russians landed troops at Yevpatoria on the west coast, north of Sevastopol. This was a daring blow, accompanied by a parachute landing and an uprising of partisans in the town. However, 11th Army improvised a battle group around 105th Infantry Regiment with some artillery, engineers and Luftwaffe ground troops. Yevpatoria was recaptured after 3 days of fighting. Then a thaw struck, turning the roads back into mud tracks and slowing the eastward move of 30th Corps. By the 14th of January, Manstein had managed to assemble 3 German divisions, plus a Romanian division and 2 Romanian brigades, for an attack on the Feodosia beachhead. The 44th Army had 4 divisions in the beachhead, and there were at least 4 more nearby in Kirch. The Russians had had over 2 weeks to prepare their defences, and if the German attack failed, they might have been left too weak to hold their positions in the eastern Crimea. Nevertheless, Manstein decided to go ahead, rather than allow the Russians to bring in more reinforcements. He had obviously come to a low opinion of the opposing Soviet generals, whose defensive mentality suggested that they and their troops were afraid of the German army. On the 15th of January, the attack began. It took 4 days to drive the Russians out of Feodosia. Around 17,000 Soviet troops were killed or captured, but Manstein was disappointed that a large number escaped to the east. He began to prepare to follow up the capture of Feodosia by clearing the Kirch Peninsula. Army Group South promised him more air support and Panzerabteilung, or tank detachment, with 60 to 75 tanks newly arrived from Germany. This was the first German tank unit to arrive in the Crimea, and the attack was set for dawn on the 26th of January. Then on the 24th, Army Group South called the tanks away to deal with a greater threat in the north. Manstein cancelled the attack immediately and shifted his army to wait on the defensive until the weather improved. The Russians, however, were not yet ready to abandon their hopes of driving 11th Army out of the Crimea. With the Kirch Straits frozen over, it was possible to bring tanks and vehicles, as well as men, across from the Taman Peninsula. Unfortunately, the weather was not reliable, and a series of thaws slowed the build-up of Soviet forces. Even so, by the beginning of February, the Soviet forces in the Crimea, now known as the Crimean Front, consisted of 4 armies. The Coastal Army in Sevastopol, and the 44th, 47th and 51st in the Kirch Peninsula. Together they commanded 17 rifle divisions, 4 mountain divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, and a large number of independent brigades and regiments. They were backed by 5 tank brigades and some smaller tank units. By comparison, 11th Army had only 7 German infantry divisions and 2 Romanian divisions, plus 2 Romanian mountain brigades and a cavalry brigade. The Germans still had no tanks. A Soviet attack was clearly imminent. In fact, Stalin was so impatient that he sent Lev Meklis, the chief commissar of the Red Army, to hurry the preparations. Meklis had taken a leading role in Stalin's purge of the officer corps. No general would dare delay an attack, however ill-prepared, if Meklis was at his side. The Soviet offensive was ordered for the 27th of February. German intelligence knew the date and even dropped leaflets over the Russian front line announcing this. Despite this, Meklis refused to delay, and the Russians attacked as predicted. They were most successful in the north, where 18th Romanian Division was driven back for 5 miles. At the same time, the Coastal Army began a series of attacks from the Sevastopol perimeter. Although at least 35 attacks were launched by the Coastal Army in a week, they were successfully checked by 54th Corps, and Manstein was even able to move another regiment across to Parpach. The fighting on the Parpach sector continued until the 3rd of March, when the Russian attacks were halted, officially because the ground was too soft for the tanks and resupply had become too difficult. But in reality, the Russian tanks were not being used effectively. Middle-ranking and senior officers did not yet have the skills and experience required to coordinate tank and infantry units. However, the weight of Soviet armor opposing 11th Army did convince the German High Command that the newly raised 22nd Panzer Division, with the mobile 28th Light Division, should be sent to the Crimea. The ground began to freeze again on the 8th of March, allowing the Russians to build up their supplies and prepare to renew their offensive. They began on the 13th of March, attacking over the whole front, but concentrating their main effort in the north. Even though the Germans estimated that they had destroyed 200 tanks by the 19th of March, they could not halt the growing salient in the north. Manstein obtained permission to use the 22nd Panzer Division, even though it was still arriving in the Crimea. On the 20th of March, the division attacked, accompanied by the 46th and 170th Infantry Divisions. It ran into a Russian assembly area, and the attack backfired. Operating with the Corps headquarters and flanking divisions that it had never trained with, 22nd Panzer had an uncomfortable baptism of fire. But Manstein felt that the arrival of German tanks would severely limit Soviet operations. New offensives were launched on the 26th of March and the 9th of April, but both were rebuffed after a few days. By the middle of April, both sides were locked into a grinding stalemate. Neither side had the power to launch an attack, but the initiative was shifting towards 11th Army. Manstein opted to begin the summer campaign with an attack at Kirch, choosing to destroy the stronger Soviet grouping first. His staff began to plan Operation Bustard Hunt. Although it was clear that the Germans were preparing an attack, the Crimean front, thanks to Meklis, did not abandon their own attack deployment. Instead of creating the deep defensive layout required by the open terrain of the Kirch Peninsula, all but 2 of the Soviet divisions were deployed within 2 or 3 miles of the front line. To make matters worse, the Russians were convinced that the Germans would concentrate their attack against the northern part of the line, where they had attacked in March. The 47th and 51st Army were packed into this salient that bulged invitingly into the German area. The 44th Army was left to cover the southern part of the Parpak Isthmus. But Manstein could see no point in attacking either the western face or southern flank of the Russian salient. He was not interested in simply pushing the Russians back towards Kirch, where they might escape back across the straits. He wanted to cut off and destroy the whole enemy force. This would not be easy, given that his forces were outnumbered by at least 2 to 1. Manstein sought every advantage he could find to compensate for his numerical weakness. A detailed deception plan was organized. 42nd German Corps and 7th Romanian Corps made very obvious preparations for an attack in the north, including simulating troop movements, building dummy artillery positions, sending false radio traffic, and carrying out very obvious reconnaissance of the Soviet line. On the other hand, no major troop movements were allowed into the 30th Corps area in the south until the night before the attack. When Manstein visited Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg on the 16th of April, he insisted that the strongest possible air support would be required. As a result, 8th Air Corps under Baron von Richthofen was assigned to support Bustard Hunt. 8th Air Corps was the Luftwaffe Specialist Ground Support Force and was reinforced to a strength of 460 aircraft for the battle. It was ordered not just to attack frontline positions, but to check the movement of Russian reserves or any attempt to pull back. The plan for the ground attack was that 30th Corps should lead the way with 3 infantry divisions. They were to break through the Russian defences and secure a route for the 22nd Panzer Division and a supporting infantry division. Their specific task was to enable 22nd Panzer Division to cross an anti-tank ditch at the back of the Soviet defences. To help in this task, an infantry battalion was loaded into assault boats to outflank the ditch by sea, though the boats were really designed for use on rivers. Once it was clear of the ditch, the Panzer Division was to drive northeast and cut off the retreat of the 2 northern armies. The 42nd and the 7th Romanian Corps would help to destroy the encircled force, while a special mobile group under Colonel Grodek would lead 2 of 30th Corps divisions in a dash to prevent Soviet reserves or retreating forward units occupying prepared lines in depth. Manstein insisted that the attack should be prepared by the 1st of May, but that it would not be launched until the weather was suitable. Fine weather was essential to dry the ground for the tanks and allow the Luftwaffe to bring its full weight to bear. Operation Bustard Hunt finally began on the 8th of May and ran almost exactly to plan. Almost every Soviet division was engaged on the first day of the operation, leaving almost no reserves. In any case, the Soviet command system was so disrupted by air attacks that the front command soon lost control of the forces. Rain during the night of the 9th and 10th of May threatened to delay the committal of the 22nd Panzer Division, but when the weather cleared and the ground dried, it became clear that the Russians were not trying to withdraw. They were still trying to hold their positions in the north and restore the line in the south by counterattacks. The 22nd Panzer Division fought some fierce tank actions, but could not be stopped from reaching the northern coast early on the 11th of May. While 42nd Corps, under General Mattenclot, coordinated the destruction of the encircled Russian divisions, Freta Pico's 30 Corps drove on towards Kirch. 42nd Corps had wiped out the northern pocket by the 13th of May. The next day, von Grodek's mobile group reached the coast, though he was mortally wounded on the way. By the 15th, Kirch was in German hands, and 3 Soviet armies had been annihilated in a week. 11th Army had captured 170,000 Soviet troops and over 1,100 guns and 250 tanks, at a total cost of just over 7,500 casualties. Operation Bustard Hunt was a miniature example of blitzkrieg tactics, planned and executed by one of the greatest masters of the art. However, Manstein still had unfinished business at Sevastopol. That would be a very different sort of battle. At the time of the German siege, Sevastopol was said to be the most strongly fortified place on Earth, and that its defences could only be breached by a massive concentration of the heaviest artillery. 208 artillery batteries were brought into position on a 22-mile front around the city. Most of these guns were conventional field artillery, but they included a unique array of specialist heavy weapons. 12 11-inch coastal artillery howitzers were the smallest of these guns, and there were another dozen 14-inch howitzers. Guns of this size had been widely used in the First World War, and all the major armies still had a number of such weapons in their armories. But the Germans had also developed some super-heavy guns that had no equivalents elsewhere. Gamma and Karl were mortars, but far removed from weapons used by the infantry. The 6 Gamma mortars had a caliber of 42 centimeters, and the 3 Karl mortars were 60 centimeter weapons. Although both types had huge tracked carriages that allowed them to move short distances under their own power, longer moves required the use of special road trailers or rail wagons. Dwarfing even these monsters was Dora, the largest gun ever used in action. In 1918, the Germans had bombarded Paris with the famous Big Bertha. The bombardment was not very effective, but the German army had been mortified that such a prestigious weapon had been developed and operated by the Navy. Between the wars, the army had been determined to develop its own supergun, and this had been achieved at the Krupp's works, where it was known as Gustav, after the head of the Krupp's family. The gunners who crewed the monster preferred their own nickname, Dora. The 80-centimeter caliber gun fired 2 types of shell. A 4-ton shell could be fired nearly 30 miles, and a 7-ton concrete-busting round had a 23-mile range. The whole system weighed about 1,350 tons and took over a month to assemble. The firing detachment consisted of 500 men, but altogether 1,420 men, under a major general, worked to support and protect the weapon. From Soviet accounts, it seems that some of the most effective guns used by the Germans during the siege were anti-aircraft weapons. Because 8th Air Corps had air supremacy in the Crimea, its commander, General von Richthofen, was able to allocate an anti-aircraft division to work with the ground troops. Its 20mm, 37mm and 88mm guns were very mobile and could be brought into positions where they could destroy fortifications by direct fire. They were especially effective against the smaller earth and wood bunkers that the Russians had built all through the Sevastopol defences. These were very difficult to locate and destroy with conventional artillery, but could hold up an infantry attack for a long time. The high-velocity shells of the anti-aircraft guns could knock these bunkers out with 1 or 2 shells and allow the attack to continue. The decision to complete the conquest of the Crimea had been taken in the spring of 1942. It would have been possible to leave Sevastopol with a smaller screening force, and used the bulk of 11th Army to cross the Kerch Straits and assist Army Group South's drive to the Caucasus. But Hitler had a fixation with the capture of famous cities, and Manstein argued that it would be operationally unsound to leave the Red Army a bridgehead in the rear of Army Group South. So preparations were made for an assault on Sevastopol, starting as soon as possible after the close of Bustard Hunt. The new plan was called Operation Blue. The defenders had not been idle during the 5-month pause in the siege. Although they'd lost much of the first defence line and the most northerly part of the main defences between the Kacha and Belbek rivers, most of the fortified gun positions were still in Soviet hands. These were supplemented by new field fortifications dug into the caves and crevices of the rugged hills around the port. New minefields were laid, using over 100,000 mines of all types. Reinforcements and supplies had been brought across the Black Sea, and the garrison now consisted of 7 rifle divisions and a number of naval infantry and other independent brigades that were almost at full strength. Their total strength was 106,625 men. They knew an attack was imminent, and were determined to hold Sevastopol at all costs. Signs began to appear on the fortifications that read, "Come on, fascist dogs, we are waiting." As in December, Manstein was obliged to make his main attack in the north. The one winding road along the coast was not suitable for heavy traffic, nor did the ground allow long-range observation of artillery fire. However, it was vital to prevent the Russians from massing too large a force in the northern sector. 30th Corps were allocated 3 divisions and about a third of the artillery for a supporting attack. Their objective was the Sapun Heights, a naturally strong ridge that had been used by the British and French armies in the Crimean War to protect their besieging force from Russian attempts to relieve Sevastopol. The battles of Inkerman and Balaclava had been fought in front of the Sapun Heights, and the British war cemetery on the ridge became part of the Soviet fortifications. North of 30th Corps, the Romanian Mountain Corps was responsible for a holding operation on the unfriendly ground of the Yala foothills. The main effort was to be made by 54th Corps, with 4 divisions and a reinforced regiment, supported by about 2/3 of the available artillery, including almost all the super-heavy guns. 42nd Corps, with 1 German division and some Romanian units, was left in the Kerch Peninsula, in case the Russians tried to repeat December's amphibious landings. Manstein was under great pressure from Hitler and the Army High Command to complete his preparations and to capture Sevastopol as quickly as possible. He knew that if there was any delay that threatened Operation Blue, the assault might be called off and 11th Army would be left in a strategic backwater. The air and artillery bombardment began on the 2nd of June. While the Luftwaffe attacked the city and harbour to disrupt Soviet communications, the artillery concentrated on counter-battery work. The permanent fortifications were easily identified and provided the first targets for the heavy guns that achieved some success. On the 6th of June, Dora fired 7 rounds at Fort Molotov and another 8 at an ammunition dump known as White Cliffs. Smoke and flames were seen coming from both positions. One shell had in fact penetrated 90 feet of rock to destroy the ammunition dump. On the same day, Karl knocked out one of the gun turrets on Maxim Gorky 1 with a direct hit. It was equally important to locate and neutralize the Soviet field artillery in their camouflaged positions. At first, these guns did not respond, but once they revealed themselves, they were subjected to a steady bombardment. The infantry assault began on the 7th of June, but there was no quick breakthrough. It was a grim struggle, reminiscent of the Battle of Verdun in the First World War. The Russians fought to the last man in their pillboxes and larger fortifications. If they lost ground, they tried to win it back by immediate counterattacks. After 10 days, some of Manstein's regiments were so exhausted that they numbered only a few hundred men. One company consisted of an officer and 8 men, and the average strength was barely 25. Manstein exchanged the weakest regiments with new units from the Kirch Peninsula so that the divisions could stay in line. The 17th of June proved to be a turning point. Both German corps suddenly changed their axes of attack. 54th Corps, having finally captured Fort Stalin and won a foothold on the Mackenzie Heights, turned west, and 6 more forts fell that day, including the famous Maxim Gorky 1. The same day, 30th Corps managed to seize a position known as the Eagle's Perch, in front of the Sapun Heights. The Corps concentrated on broadening this penetration to form a start line for an attack on the heights themselves. 54th Corps spent the next few days clearing the northern shore of Severnaya Bay. German artillery now dominated the harbour, and supplies could only be brought in at great risk. The submarine M32 was nearly lost while delivering petrol supplies. As it lay on the harbour bottom to avoid daylight air attacks, leaking petrol fumes almost knocked out the entire crew. One chief petty officer remained conscious, and he managed to bring the submarine to the surface. The Russians were still defending their positions ruthlessly, but they no longer seemed to have the reserves or the ammunition for counterattacks. Once again, the critical moment was approaching, and again it was Manstein who sensed the changing balance and found the means to tip it in 11th Army's favour. Although the Germans had broken through the main belt of defences, the rear position was untouched. It was based on the steep Sapun Heights and ran from Inkerman in the north to Windmill Hill and Fort Maxim Gorky 2 on the south coast. There seemed no alternative to a frontal attack by 30th Corps, but the roads in that sector were not good enough to move the heavy artillery and ammunition that would be required. It is a mark of Manstein's desperation at this point that when the fall of Tobruk in North Africa was reported, he asked Army Group South if the commander of the British garrison could be sent to the Crimea. Manstein thought that he might be dropped into Sevastopol by parachute, and that this proof of German success in siege warfare would create a strong demoralizing effect on the Soviet defenders. Not surprisingly, nothing more was heard of this plan, and shortly afterwards Manstein produced the idea that was the key to final victory. On one of the daily visits to forward units, he went to an artillery observation post in the 54th Corps area that had an excellent view over Severnaya Bay. The bay was the main fleet anchorage and up to 1,000 yards wide. The southern shore was well defended, with tiers of strong points dug into the cliffs. But Manstein began to wonder if it would be possible to launch an attack across Severnaya Bay and then take the Sapun Heights defences from the flank. 54th Corps staff were not enthusiastic. How could they even get assault boats down to the shore, let alone across the bay, in the face of such defences? Manstein's response was simple. If the Russians considered an attack across Severnaya Bay to be impossible, they would not expect the Germans to even attempt it. For that reason alone, the Germans had to attempt it. Everything would depend on achieving surprise for the crossing that was set for the night of the 28th and 29th of June. There was to be no artillery preparation, but every available gun stood by to bombard the southern cliffs if the alarm was raised as 100 assault boats crossed the bay. The leading regiments were ashore before the Soviet defenders realized what was happening, and as dawn broke, 30th Corps joined in by threatening a wide frontal attack on the heights, but then launching a concentrated attack by 170th Division along the main road to Sevastopol. With massed airstrikes and the direct fire of an anti-aircraft regiment, the division reached the crest and then broadened its penetration so that other divisions could move up in support. 28th Light Division captured the strong point at the British cemetery on the ridge, as 170th Division pressed on until it reached the Kessonaz Peninsula at the western tip of the Crimea. The Russians were forced back to the Crimean War fortifications, and on the 30th of June, the famous Fort Malakoff was captured. By now, the defenders were short of ammunition and other supplies, and suffering a day-long aerial bombardment from 8th Air Corps. Admiral Oktyabrsky received Stavka's permission to evacuate Sevastopol that night. Several hundred high-priority personnel were carried off by air, and about 3,000 managed to escape in light craft of the Black Sea's fleet. On the 1st of July, resistance collapsed, although some positions held on for a few more days. Maxim Gorky too was the last fort to be captured. And even then, some of the defenders refused to surrender and were buried alive when German engineers exploded demolition charges. The 11th Army had finally conquered the Crimea. Hitler was delighted with the victory, which seemed a good omen for the start of the 1942 campaign. Manstein was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal, and a special Crimea Shield was awarded to all the personnel of 11th Army. On the Soviet side, a medal for the defense of Sevastopol was instituted, and after the war, Sevastopol was named as one of the hero cities of the Soviet Union. It was right that both sides recognized the individual valor of their ordinary soldiers, who overcame appalling conditions and fought beyond the limits of endurance. At this stage of the war, the tactical skills of the German soldier could still compensate for the numerical superiority of the Russians, but the Crimea campaign showed they were equal in courage. However, although the Red Army had some very able and determined commanders, Manstein had that touch of military genius that proved decisive and swung the balance in the Crimea. Unfortunately for Germany, he was not allowed to remain in southern Russia. Hitler decided that Manstein's genius lay in capturing trophy cities, and he ordered that his new field marshal and the greater part of his 11th Army should be transferred to the other end of the Eastern Front and conquer Leningrad. Even though one of the original objectives of the Crimean campaign had been to put at least a strong force over the Kerch Straits to help capture the Caucasus, the striking power of Manstein's army was dispersed over the Eastern Front. The invasion of the Caucasus continued. But as Hitler's attention became centered on Stalingrad, the campaign faltered. The Russians kept control of the oil fields and most of the Black Sea coast. After the fall of Stalingrad, the Germans were forced to retreat, but managed to hang on to the Kuban bridgehead, including the Taman Peninsula, and so deny the Red Army a route back to the Crimea. In 1943, the strategic focus lay in central Russia, where the Battle of Kursk proved that the balance was definitely turning against Germany. Army Group A under Field Marshal von Kleist held on to the Gottenkopf position in the Kuban throughout the summer of 1943, but the Soviet advances in the Ukraine after Kursk left it hopelessly isolated. Hitler gave permission to evacuate the Kuban on the 3rd of September, and most of von Kleist's men were hurried through the Crimea only just in time before the Red Army's advance across the southern Ukraine reached the Black Sea coast between the Crimea and the river Dnieper. The Crimea was cut off, and the German and Russian armies once again faced each other across the Sivash. In November, the Black Sea Fleet and the Azov Flotilla carried troops of the North Caucasus Front across the Kerch Straits. At first, they could only cling on to two small beachheads at Kirch and Eltigen, but at the end of the year, new landings at Feodosia on the north shore put most of the Kerch Peninsula back in Soviet hands. As the winter operations came to an end, the Crimea was still occupied by a German and Romanian force under the 17th Army, commanded by General Erwin Jeinecke. One opportunity to evacuate the peninsula had already been lost in late October 1943. Jeinecke and the commander of Army Group South Ukraine, Field Marshal von Kleist, had both called for the peninsula to be abandoned once the Kuban evacuation was complete. They were told that Hitler would not allow the word Crimea to be mentioned in his presence. Marshal Antonescu also wanted to get his troops out of the Crimea, but Hitler insisted that it must be held. His justification was that the Crimea could be used as a base for air attacks on the Romanian oil fields, or for amphibious landings on the Black Sea coast of Romania and Bulgaria. Von Kleist therefore told Jeinecke to defend the Crimea. At first, Jeinecke refused, saying he would not be responsible for another Stalingrad. After a bitter telephone argument, he gave in. Although the generals continued to press for a sea evacuation during early 1944, Hitler refused to accept that there was no strategic justification for holding the Crimea. In fact, he insisted on reinforcing the 17th Army, which grew from 1 division to 5. With a mass of logistic units, Russian volunteer troops and labourers, Luftwaffe and naval personnel, there were nearly 250,000 men in the Crimea, although only a small proportion could be described as combat troops. The Russians were in no hurry to begin an attack. Their propaganda mocked the Crimea as their biggest and safest prisoner of war camp, where the Germans fed and guarded themselves, and if they left on leave, came back of their own accord. But the Soviet General Staff were preparing a series of offensives that would sweep up and down the Eastern Front throughout 1944. The opening move would be in the north, to free Leningrad from its 3-year-long siege. Then the Red Army would strike in the south to complete the liberation of the Crimea. The battles would be fought over the same ground as Manstein's campaign of 1941 and 1942, but both armies were very different organizations. The German army was no longer riding on a wave of 2 years of unbroken success. Although it could still win small victories, the big battles eluded them. Manstein had fought with divisions that were often under strength, but reinforcements had always arrived. By 1944, the German manpower pool was becoming exhausted, and divisions, regiments, battalions often existed only in name. The German soldier would still fight with skill and courage, but increasingly from desperation rather than belief in his inevitable victory. The Russian soldier knew that the German army could be beaten, and was determined to take revenge for the damage done to his homeland. Although the Red Army did not have limitless manpower resources, its units were maintained at combat-effective levels, and soldiers and junior leaders were no longer badly trained. The greatest change in quality, though, was among the generals. It was the German High Command who were now most affected by the dictatorial whims of an incompetent political leader and his cronies. Most of the great leaders of the early years had lost Hitler's trust. Manstein himself was sacked by Hitler at the end of March 1944. Stalin, on the other hand, had settled into a reasonable working relationship with his general staff. His generals understood each other well and had developed an operational formula that made the best use of the Red Army's strengths and disguised its weaknesses. The coming offensive in the Crimea, like the other strategic offensives of 1944, would demonstrate that the Red Army was no clumsy steamroller, winning by sheer numbers, but a flexible and sophisticated military machine, mastering the classic military virtues of surprise, concentration, maneuver, and speed. The generals directing the operation were typical of the new breed of Russian field commanders. The group of officers who planned and commanded the Crimean operation provide a typical cross-section of the Soviet High Command in the final stages of the war. The oldest was Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, who had been a comrade of Stalin during the Russian Civil War, particularly during the fighting at Tsaritsyn, later renamed Stalingrad. When Stalin came to power, he appointed his old comrade Commissar for War in 1925, a position he held until 1940. The war with Finland and the first year of the war with Germany highlighted Voroshilov's incompetence, and Stalin used him as a scapegoat for early defeats. However, he escaped the purges that destroyed better commanders and was given a series of high-sounding but unimportant appointments. In sending Voroshilov as Stavka representative with the Independent Coastal Army, Stalin was rehabilitating his loyal supporter, but he took good care to send General Stemenko, the very competent head of the operations department, to make sure that nothing went wrong. Voroshilov represented the old guard of politically reliable but militarily incompetent commanders who had plagued the Red Army at the start of the war. The new breed was typified by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, the chief of the General Staff, who was sent to oversee the 4th Ukrainian Front. He was not yet 50, but had been identified as one of the brightest brains of the young Red Army between the wars, and was promoted quickly within the General Staff until he became its head in June 1942. However, he spent less than half his time in Moscow. Once the basic work of planning an operation had been completed, Vasilevsky was usually sent out as a Stavka representative. These men were the links between Stalin and the generals commanding the armies and fronts or groups of armies in the field. Vasilevsky took a leading role in all the Red Army's great victories, such as Stalingrad and Kursk, the 1944 offensives, and the war against Japan in Manchuria in 1945. He was a quiet and calm man who might have been a priest or a teacher, but for the Bolshevik Revolution. His professional ability was unquestioned, and he was never seen simply as Stalin's messenger by the front commanders whose operations he supervised, including General Tolbukin. Fyodor Tolbukin had been a front chief of staff during the First Crimean Campaign, which left his career under a cloud. However, he redeemed himself by his performance as an army commander at the time of Stalingrad, and as a front commander throughout 1943. He was a meticulous planner, and before the attack on the Crimea spoke to every regimental commander to make sure that he understood exactly what his troops were required to do. By 1944, every Soviet front seemed to have a reliable commander such as Tolbukin, capable of planning and executing complex operations to a strict schedule. One potent weapon the Soviets had was numbers. At the start of the operation, the German defenders of the Crimea numbered just over 200,000 men, whereas the Russians had 470,000 waiting to strike. They were backed by nearly 6,000 guns and mortars, compared to 3,600 German weapons. The Russians also had 560 tanks and self-propelled guns, opposing 215 German armoured fighting vehicles. The greatest Soviet advantage was in the air, where the Luftwaffe had less than 300 planes to face 1,250 Russian aircraft. But the Germans were holding strong defensive positions on the narrow isthmuses at Kirch and Perekop, and a quick victory was not guaranteed. The Germans had faced and beaten such odds before. The Russians could attack the Crimea from two directions, from Kirch or from Perekop and the Sivash. Stavka decided to use both axes. The main attack would be launched in the north by Tolbukin's 4th Ukrainian Front, with a supporting attack by the Independent Coastal Army at Kirch starting 2 or 3 days later. To oppose them, the German 17th Army had 5 German and 7 Romanian divisions. 3 German infantry divisions under 49th Mountain Corps and a Romanian cavalry division and 2 infantry divisions forming the 3rd Romanian Cavalry Corps were deployed in the north. The 5th Corps held the Kirch Peninsula with 2 German infantry divisions, a Romanian mountain division and a Romanian cavalry division. Coastal defence and anti-partisan security was in the hands of a mixture of Romanian units. Deep defences had been built at both Perekop and Kirch. The Germans knew that they had to hold the Russians in those sectors where the ground was narrowest, preventing the Russians from deploying their full strength. Once these defences were breached, the Germans would be unable to repel the Soviet armoured forces in the wide open spaces of the central Crimea, and would have to fall back to Sevastopol. Defence lines had been constructed around the city, but the Germans had neither the time nor the resources to rebuild the shattered Soviet fortifications. However, they could hope to hold the Russians long enough to organise an evacuation across the Black Sea. The main blow had to come in the north, where it was possible to assemble and supply an overwhelming force of artillery, armour and other troops to support the assaulting infantry. The obvious, if only, axis of attack was over the Perekop Isthmus, which had been used in Manstein's attack. The German defenders were concentrated in this sector. However, in their drive across the Ukraine at the end of 1943, the Russians had managed to seize some small bridgeheads on the southern shore of the Sivash Sea. They were too small to use as assembly areas for a major force, but Soviet engineers began to build causeways and footbridges back across the Sivash. They were built at night, often using German prisoners as labourers, and were hidden from air reconnaissance because they lay just below the surface of the water. 2nd Guards Army would pin down the main German force by attacking at Perekop, but the main blow would be delivered by 51st Army across the Sivash. For 5 days before the attack, heavy artillery pounded strongpoints in the German line. The assault began on the 8th of April with a 2.5-hour bombardment by every available gun, mortar and rocket launcher. Second Guards Army led the way, and after 2 days' struggle managed to pass the first line of defences at Perekop, but were held at the next line in the Ishun Defile. But while German attention was fixed on Perekop, 51st Army was winning the battle further east. Using the underwater roads and various boats and pontoons, wading through the freezing water where necessary, the Soviet troops shook the 10th Romanian Division, whose resistance collapsed on the 9th of April. By the next day, the Soviet front line was clear of the narrow defiles between the lakes, and 19th Tank Corps was moving forward. General Jaineke gave the order to retreat to the Gneisenau stop line in front of Simferopol. On the 9th of April, the Coastal Army had begun its attack at Kirch. Under steady pressure, the Germans were forced to withdraw to their rearward lines across the narrowest part of the peninsula, at Akhmonai. But when the Russians began their breakout in the north, there was no point in delaying any longer. 5th Corps began its retreat to Sevastopol. Those units falling back along the winding coast road were able to keep stopping and checking the pursuing Russians. But those who moved over the more open ground north of the Yala Mountains had a more difficult task. Like their comrades retreating from Perekop, they were harried by mobile groups formed by every Soviet formation. Manstein had improvised similar detachments in the mobile stages of his operations, but in 1944 the Russian groups were far better equipped and much more powerful. They were trained to bypass points of resistance and press on into the enemy rear, seizing crossing points and communication centres, and reaching reserve defences before they could be occupied by the Germans. The German and Romanian forces had to keep moving, or they were cut off and surrounded. Units got back to Sevastopol, but they'd been shredded by the relentless pressure. Equipment had to be abandoned, and the men who escaped death or capture arrived at Sevastopol with no more than a personal weapon and a rucksack. During its 150-mile march from Kirch, the 73rd Infantry Division lost nearly 4/5 of its men. Perhaps there were as many as 120,000 men in Sevastopol on the 16th of April, but 17th Army considered that its real combat strength was no more than 25,000 German soldiers in the 5 Kampfgruppen, or battle groups, which were all that were left of their 5 divisions. The troops in the Kampfgruppen were ready to fight on, but they also assumed that they would be evacuated in the end. But as often before, military logic made no impression on Hitler. He chose to believe the most optimistic reports about the strength of the Sevastopol defences and the ability of Navy and Air Force to support the besieged force. He argued that it was necessary to hold the city in order to keep Turkey neutral for another couple of months, long enough to beat off the expected Anglo-American landings in France. He refused to allow an evacuation and sacked General Jaineke because of his continued protests. About 65,000 men were left in Sevastopol at the beginning of May, facing 3 Soviet armies with 27 divisions and over 450,000 men. The German plan for the defence of Sevastopol assumed that the Russians would have to make their main attack in the north, as Manstein had done, because the road and rail network was so much better there. So most of their infantry and mobile artillery were concentrated north of Severnaya Bay, to deny the Russians the Mackenzie Heights. However, once again, Tolbukin thought he could make a major attack over ground the Germans considered unsuitable. He began with a feint attack in the north, where 2nd Guards Army attacked the Mackenzie Heights early on the 5th of May. But 51st Army and the Independent Coastal Army were to strike the decisive blow against the Sapun Heights east of Sevastopol. Under cover of darkness, the assaulting force was assembled for an H-hour on the 7th of May. The attack began with a 90-minute artillery bombardment, with 200 guns firing on each kilometre of the attack front. But the key to success was concentrated air power. After 2 days backing 2nd Guards Army, 8th Air Army switched 1,000 aircraft to support the new attack. By the middle of the morning, the red flag was flying on the Sapun Heights, and the fate of Sevastopol was sealed. With defeat staring the Germans in the face, Hitler finally authorized an evacuation late on the 8th of May. It was far too late. A final position had been prepared on the Chersonas Peninsula, and as 19th Tank Corps was released from Balaclava, the Germans abandoned Sevastopol in a rush to reach this last refuge. And on the first night, the 9th of 10th of May, 15,000 men were taken off the peninsula. However, once daylight came, the Soviet Air Force struck at the convoys. Only a small number of men were rescued during the next night. A convoy of a dozen ships got to within 25 or 30 kilometres of the shore during the 11th of May, but at least 4 of them were sunk by air attack while they waited for landing craft to ferry troops to them. Conditions on shore were equally grim. The last days were spent under constant air and artillery bombardment. The wounded and the non-combatant troops were crammed into the passageways of the ruined Soviet coastal forts, while the remaining fighting troops clung to their trenches on the bare Chersonas plateau. Drivers, cooks and clerks took up arms and joined the front line. At least 20,000 men were left on the Chersonas. Resistance was hopeless, and they began to surrender, marching off into captivity in long columns for the benefit of Soviet newsreel cameras. Some preferred to risk the sea and set out in any boat or makeshift raft they could find. Most were drowned, but during the night of the 12th and 13th of May, the first motorboat flotilla made one last sweep and picked up 83 men, the last remnant of 17th Army.